Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Secretary of State, thank you very much for coming to appear before us this morning. As ever, we have a great deal of ground to cover, so colleagues' short questions and succinct answers from you, Secretary of State, would be much appreciated. Can I begin with the meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement? Leaving aside when that agreement is concluded, how long will Parliament have to scrutinise it before we vote on it?
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Chairman. Firstly, yes, I'll be as brief as I can. Can I just make a point at the moment? My department's normally under high time pressure. At the moment, we're dealing with the high pace of negotiations, diplomacy, policy on Parliament fronts, and so we're very tight. My office has told your clerk that I've got to limit this to an hour and a half. So it's, I mean, no discourtesy by this, but we do have, my next meeting is very, very important to me. So I just want to make that point at the beginning. Now, meaningful vote.
Can I just then say something on that subject? Because I speak, I think, on behalf of the whole of the committee that I don't think that really will do, because part of your responsibilities is to appear before the Select Committee and to be accountable to Parliament. And I think this is the second occasion where you have said, as far as I'm aware, a specific reason, apart from having another meeting, has not been given. We've all got other meetings, but the committee has got a lot of ground to cover. These sessions are very important to us in enabling us to do our work, and I don't think an hour and a half is satisfactory. So may I say that to you?
Well, I understand that. I hear what you say. We have today, as is well known, a Cabinet Committee this afternoon, which I have to have various things done before we do, so before we start. So I make the point to you. I hope we can get through this in an hour and a half. If not, we'll write to you with answers to questions that are left outstanding. And of course, as always, I'll try and make myself available whenever possible. If you remember, on one occasion I came at 2 days' notice to the committee. So, all right, now meaningful vote.
Let's just conclude this. Would you be willing then to come back pretty speedily to conclude the session if you want to cut it short to an hour and a half today?
I think. Well, let's see how we get on, and then we'll see how we deal with that, Chairman. I mean, we'll try and get through this as briskly as we can. We've got a lot of things to talk about. And of course, as always, I'll try and make myself available. I have, as I have done this last 3 weeks. Last week I was appearing in front of a Lords Committee. Next week again another Lords Committee here today. And as I said to you, we have the maximum pace at the moment on negotiation, diplomacy, policy, and parliamentary activity. Now, meaningful vote. Timing. One of the things we've said on the issue of the vote, the first vote. There will be several votes on the outcome of this negotiation. One, the first one will be what's been referred to as the meaningful vote, a vote on the overall treaty and agreement in the House, in both houses. I've given undertakings, I think actually at your request, Chairman, but it may have been Keir Starmer's, I think it was yours. At your request that we do this before the European Parliament has...
Secretary of State, I'm aware of that. Mine was a very simple question. How long will Parliament have to scrutinise the draft agreement once it is concluded by the negotiators
and my point
before we ask to vote on it?
Right.
Is it a week, 2 weeks, a month?
Well, I don't know at this stage, but I'm laying out what the parameters will be. At one end, you want, as you've said yourself, that we will do this before the European Parliament will vote on it, right?
We know that.
And we've said, and I said in terms, that's what we will endeavour to do, right? So we have a pace on us to deliver you a vote in that timetable. I'm not going to try and preempt what the usual channels will determine, which is how long, how much time, what the actual draft of the bill will, of the vote will be. And also, I make this other point to you. Unlike most votes in the House, in the previous several months, you will have seen unveiled or put in front of the public and in front of Parliament all the elements of the negotiation. We already know large parts of what's going to be put in front of the House. We'll know all of it in terms, all except the very last bits of negotiation way before we are in a position to put it to the House. Now, you'll then have a statement, and then I imagine not too long after that, you'll have the vote. But that will be a matter for usual channels at that stage, I think.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, we will be presented as Parliament with an impact assessment of the withdrawal agreement before we vote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. Can you give us a short...
Let's be exact. Given the issue on words on this particular issue, precision of words, we've said we'll give you an economic assessment. That's the point, an economic assessment.
An economic assessment,
yeah.
Right. Can you give an assurance that the government motion on the withdrawal agreement will be amendable? Yes or no?
Mr. Chairman, if you can tell me how to write an unamendable motion in the House of Commons, I'll take a tutorial.
So it will be amendable. Thank you very much.
I think so.
And the government...
I'm looking around at various people who are very likely to amend it. Yes, sir.
It's just very helpful to get that assurance from you. And the government will, of course, treat the result of that vote as binding on it.
Well, the government is unlikely to put a vote to the House, which it does not intend to take properly seriously, yes.
So what does that mean?
What I just said. Yeah.
So the
yes,
government...
in other words, if the House rejects the proposed negotiation, then that negotiation will fall.
Fine. Now, can I turn to the negotiations?
There are at least two chances of that, because of course you'll then have the second reading of the withdrawal and implementation bill, which will incorporate all of that, which will also be another test.
Well, I
expect
we'll explore that.
Of course, the government has absolutely no choice constitutionally.
Indeed. I expect we'll probably explore that in a bit more detail later on in the session. Now, on the last two occasions you've appeared before us, you have said that the negotiations on our future relationship, I'm not talking about the withdrawal agreement, will be concluded by the end of the Article 50 period, which Michel Barnier, of course, thinks means by the autumn. Is that still your view?
Well, Michel Barnier separates this out, bear in mind. The Article 50 period is the end, but what the end of the March 2019. But the Article 50 lays down in terms that the withdrawal agreement has to take into account the future relationship. So you have to have substantially agreed what the future relationship will be at the point you agree the withdrawal agreement. So yes.
Right, so you think that is still possible.
Yeah.
Now, will the document on the future relationship be a political declaration or a draft treaty?
It will be, at that stage, a statement of the Council. I would not imagine we'll have legal text at that point.
So what status will it have if it's just a statement of the Council?
I think nearer to political declaration than draft treaty. It will not be in draft as a legal text at that stage. That time there won't be possible.
So it's likely to be a political declaration, and a political declaration is not a treaty.
No, it's not a treaty.
No, it's not. Right.
Well, again, to remind you of previous evidence, Mr. Chairman, when I've appeared in front of this committee, I've reminded you that the requirements of European law are that they cannot sign a treaty with us until we are a third country. And that means they can't sign a treaty, which is any point at which the treaty becomes in any way binding, until the first days of April, the last day of March in 2019.
So how can Parliament set any store by it if it's asked to vote on this whole process when the really important question of our future relationship is merely a statement of the Council in the form of a political declaration and not a draft treaty? Well,
that doesn't mean the Council won't view it as binding. After all, we have in the past come to, I mean, each of the agreements we've come into in December and March are seen as binding, but they're not legally binding, but we view them as completely politically binding, and that's pretty forceful. And I remember I made this point in December, and people got into a terrible uproar saying, "Oh, it's not legally binding." He's saying it's not legally binding. Well, it wasn't, as the Commission confirmed. It doesn't mean we don't view it as binding. It is binding.
Now, it's been reported you want to send over hundreds of civil servants to negotiate 40 to 50 strands of work between now and October. Is that happening?
It will. I mean, what we've been having, as is in the public domain, discussions with the Commission in the last week and this week, and some of that's been about Northern Ireland, and some of it's been about the customs proposals. Some of it has been, and the most important bit in some ways at this stage, has been about how we organise the substantive negotiation. Because if we send over however many officials and there's nobody there to talk to them, that's pointless. What we are in the process of doing is discussing that with them. But yes, it will happen.
It will happen, but has that been agreed by Michel Barnier yet?
That's what Michel said, because I talked to him about this before the March agreement, and what he said in the press conference was that the future partnership will have to be dealt with. All elements of the future partnership will have to be dealt with in parallel, which is another way of saying the same thing. You can look the quote up. It was the March press conference.
Now, if, as you've just confirmed, that the political declaration covering our future relationship is all we're likely to get as part of the withdrawal agreement, then inevitably negotiations on a treaty to give effect to that political declaration are going to spill over into the transition period, isn't that correct?
Not inevitably. I mean, bear in mind, you've just left out a 6-month lacuna in that. Between October of this year and March of 2019. So it does not inevitably mean it will spill over into the...
But it might?
It is not our intention that it will.
Indeed, but that depends on the other side.
It does, and I do not expect. I mean, various important players, not in the negotiating team, but various important players have made it very plain that they want the substantive future partnership to be very detailed. Angela Merkel, for example, said that, even in October. So there's no reason why we can't turn a very detailed substantive arrangement into the treaty before the end of the Article 50 period.
And when that is turned into a treaty, then there will be a separate further vote in Parliament on that when it comes before us.
Yeah, well, firstly, the de minimis position is that the constitutional reform and the CRAG Act will apply. That's the de minimis position. But I expect that, well, there may be more than one treaty for a start. I mean, it's impossible. We don't know what the full structure of the treaty will look like, whether security and defence will be separate from the future economic partnership. It's quite possible. And they will have, some of these things will have substantive domestic effects, so they will of course come with Acts of Parliament for the House as well.
Okay. Now, can I turn to the question of customs arrangements in the Northern Ireland border? We understand you visited the border on Monday, but it doesn't appear that you are much closer to finding an answer. Now, you said on Monday, I think, we hope to have this sorted by October, but it has been reported that the European Council wants to see significant progress by June. So how are you going to do in 2 months what you haven't been able to do in 22 months thus far?
Well, the first thing to say is that perhaps the most important voice on this would have been Leo Varadkar, who said he would rather see a good agreement in October than any agreement in June, unquote. So what's reported, I don't know what the veracity of it is. We'll make progress as fast as we can on this. There are some hard issues at the core of it, as we well know, but our undertaking is very plain. We will maintain, we will avoid a hard border at all costs. We will underpin the peace process, the Belfast, the so-called the Good Friday Agreement, and all the elements of it, and we will come up with a mechanism which will enable that to happen at the border. Now, what we have said all along, and indeed the Council agreed, and indeed Mr. Varadkar agreed, was the best way to do that was with a good agreement. A good free trade agreement, because that then eliminates a lot of the issues from the beginning. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And that's the way we're addressing it. We will, of course, address what they could term options A, B, and C, and the free trade agreement is option A, but we'll address all three of them in that time.
But you've just accepted, Secretary of State, that there isn't going to be a trade agreement in the form of a treaty by October, because it's going to be a political declaration, and yet a deal on Northern Ireland has to form part of the withdrawal agreement. Now, you proposed two options last October, a customs partnership and using technology. The first of those seems to have been emphatically rejected by the Commission. Is that correct?
The first of me, no. No, I mean...
So they're still open to a customs partnership,
the Commission has taken an open negotiating position. So that's where it is at the moment. You must not assume that every statement from the Commission lasts forever. I suggest the committee goes back and looks at the early statements by the Commission, for example, on the role of the court, and sees how that has moved over time in the negotiation. So that's our negotiating position. They have criticised various elements of each of the options, each of the two options talked about. We will go back and address those in negotiation. That's what a negotiation is for.
Right. So they haven't accepted it, but you're saying they haven't rejected it?
It's the first day, as it were, or the first few days of this round of negotiations. It's the opening position.
It's all a bit late, though, isn't it?
No, it's not. Look, I mean, the commission itself. Bear in mind the interaction of this. And by the way, you conflated entry into force with the treaty signing and so forth in talking about the relationship between the future agreement and the withdrawal agreement and the arrangement with Northern Ireland. The effective importance of the Northern Irish arrangement is at the end of when it comes into effect, is the end of the implementation period. Because until the implementation period is over, we are de facto operating within the single market, within the customs union. It's at the end of that takes effect. So that's when it has to impact. No, I don't accept that we're in anything like as difficult a position as you describe. It is, of course, not straightforward. It's not going to be an easy negotiation. Nobody has pretended that, and certainly not me in the course of my time in this job.
Has the government had any talks with suppliers or businesses about the technology you want to use under the second proposal?
The B proposal.
Yeah, using technology to get rid of a border.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and some of the technology exists already. Indeed, most of it exists already. And I was talking, you mentioned I was in Northern Ireland, I was talking to one of the industry groups there at that time about their requirements on this, actually to supply the UK through the Irish Republic. But much of the technology already exists, but it's a question of the extent to which it is used. So, for example, automatic number plate recognition exists already inside Northern Ireland in terms of tracking patterns of big shipments and so on. But in terms of the authorised economic operator, that exists at the moment, but not in sufficient quantity to make this work. Electronic pre-notification exists at the moment. Indeed, a great deal of work of the compliance of traders across the border on issues such as excise, there's already an excise border there, is done electronically, as you would expect, and done by either pre or post notification. So a lot of these things exist already. What we're doing, what that particular so-called maximum facilitation option does is take all the best practices from around the world and in different parts of it and put them together into one. So it's not, no component of it's new, although the overall size of it is new, or would be new.
But have you started discussions with any suppliers of the technology, talked about lead times, putting in place a plan for actually making it happen, as opposed to saying it exists around the world?
Some of it is already being done by HMRC's planning.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think you had the head of HMRC here speaking about this, who said to you, if I remember correctly, there is no need for a hard border in Northern Ireland under his organisation's plans.
Now, finally from me, you've emphatically rejected remaining in a customs union, but when the trade bill returns to the House will vote on whether it wishes to adopt a different policy, i.e. to remain in a customs union. If that's carried, you're going to have to change your policy, aren't you?
Well, I'm not going to enter into hypotheticals on what the House may or may not do, and if the government is defeated in these arguments, I expect the government's policy to be upheld.
But if it isn't, you're going to have to respect it, aren't you?
The government always respects Parliament, but I expect the government's policy to be upheld.
Very helpful.
For good reason.
Thank you. Stephen Crabb.
Mr. Chairman. Secretary of State, last time you were here, you told us about how you changed your view on the wisdom of staying inside the customs union. Do you now regard the customs union as a protectionist racket?
You're trying to put words in my mouth, Mr. Crown. Look, the customs union, it's like all customs unions, is designed for the interests of the countries within it. It has advantages for them. When we joined back in the 70s, from about 72 to about 85, we saw a significant improvement in our trade with Europe off the back of that. It sort of tapered off after that, but I wouldn't use those phrases. I try to avoid pejorative phrases in my job because diplomacy is a large part of it.
So what's motivating yours and your colleagues in government position towards the customs union right now? Is it because you are persuaded that the economic upside of new trade deals, that there are game-changing economic opportunities out there for the United Kingdom that we need the freedom to be able to get? Or is it more about the symbolic freedom in itself of being able to strike trade deals?
It's more the former. Two things. I mean, the Commission itself has said in terms that the 90% of the growth in world trade will come from outside the Union, which is what we're talking about here, our participation in global trade, both inside and outside the Union. You see harbingers of this in our own position. Even inside the Union, we have gone from roughly 60% of our trade being into the Union versus 40% of the rest of the world, to a position in a year or two's time when that will be reversed, that 40% to the Union and 6% of the rest of the world. Now, you mustn't throw away 40%, so you've got to do something to defend that. But the 60% is the big area where we have huge opportunities, in my view.
But do you accept that none of the government's own data modelling show that these potential future trade deals outweigh, the gains from those outweigh the potential loss?
The trouble with the modelling is you have to make the modelling is based on guesses about what will happen to our trade levels, whether there'll be a significant reduction in trade with the European Union. That's what most of these models actually include, and very, very small increases for the rest of the world. In fact, the secular trends deny that. What is more, just one element of what the Council's guidelines said. The Council said up front that it wants to avoid tariffs and quotas. So straight away, even outside, if we can keep that option in the negotiation, the arguments for sudden sharp downturns in trade with the Union tend to fall apart. But it all hangs. It's one of the reasons I talked to this committee before. I have been rather, dismissive is the wrong word, but not particularly enamoured of mathematical modelling techniques, is they all sit on assumptions about what will happen to trade. And if you get that assumption wrong, the whole model is wrong.
So you regard the government's modelling as wrong?
Well, the best modelling in the world is wrong, is what I say to you, and I've said that. I think the last time I was here, I said that the Bank of England accepted. I think the deputy governor referred to a Michael Fish moment about modelling because they couldn't predict it, and the Queen famously in 2008 said, "Why did nobody see this coming?" Talking about the financial crash. So I mean, there are a fair few examples of modelling being wrong. Even the OBR, I know that they're brilliant at what they do. They're very, very good. But look at the size of errors in the forecasting of debt borrowing levels. I mean, the previous Chancellor had a fantastic windfall one year. I think 26 billion was found down the back of the sofa. That was a modelling error beforehand.
Finally, Secretary of State, can I put to you, do you not agree that in the same way that there are some people who now argue that after Brexit, so we can have a liberal immigration policy because we will be making a sovereign choice to have that kind of liberal immigration system, and that it's a free choice for us and it's in our national interest? Similarly, some people say, after we leave the EU, it may be that we choose to maintain EU-style regulation because we recognise it's in our national interest and it's a free sovereign choice for us to do that. It's not being forced on us. If you're persuaded that staying inside some kind of customs partnership is in our national interest, do you not see that there's a strong argument, similar with the two examples I've just mentioned, that a free sovereign choice to be part of that arrangement would be in our national interest?
Well, the reason I first changed my mind was because looking at the size of the opportunity outside. I mean, I'm not somebody who's ever been nailed to a particular ideology on these things, and particularly in the area of free trade. Free trade is never perfect. On immigration, you know better than me, given your history, about that area. Yet my job is to get the decision back to Parliament, the decision back to the UK government, and then for them to make individual decisions in the best interests of the UK, both its economy, its social structure, and whatever. So, and that's why when we talked about a free trade agreement with an a generous and comprehensive free trade agreement with an associated customs agreement, if you have no tariffs, if you have no quotas, if you have mutual recognition of standards, why would you have a very high friction border? And if you can avoid that, then that takes away the advantage of a customs union. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Craig McKinnon.
Thank you. Just discussing where we like to be with EU citizens. The Prime Minister has mentioned that we want a streamlined system, get rid of the 80 pages of filling in that is currently the case. Has there been any progress thus far on within the Home Office that you know of as to what that streamlined process might look like? Will it be drawing on national insurance data? What are the thoughts thus far?
A great deal of progress. I mean, what's been done? I mean, there's a whole effort going on this to make it user-centred, right? And so to that end, just as an aside, we've got groups set up which involve EU citizens here. We've had, of course, liaison with all the embassies and so on. Now, coming back to the information base, the aim is to make it absolutely the minimal necessary work from the point of view of the individual making the application. So we intend, for example, to use things like HMRC data and allow people to effectively prove their work history by referring to their own HMRC data. So yes, that's what we're aiming to do. And some of that started.
Have you got any indications as to what EU and other EU countries are thinking of on the reciprocal basis for our citizens thus far?
Not at this stage, no we don't. At least I don't. I mean, it's, we have to return to the citizens' rights issue under the ongoing relationship arrangement.
Because this is the bit that's still in white, isn't it, and not agreed in the...
Well, I think, oh gosh, from memory, I think the citizens' rights in the withdrawal agreement is green, but it doesn't include everything we would necessarily like. As we've said very publicly, voting rights and onward movement rights and other things. But the voting rights we may never resolve with respect to the union. We may have to do all of that bilaterally, but I've already raised that with many of my opposite numbers there, and I haven't. None of those I've raised it with. I haven't raised it with the most difficult countries, but none of those I've raised it with have had a problem with it. They've said yes, we want to deal with this bilaterally. So we have. That's not what we're doing. We're not doing that via the union. But other issues we will be raising via the union. Onward movement is one. You know, and when we deal with that, we're going to have to address how the practicalities of how it's done, because it will then have actually more complex practicalities than we're facing with the 3 million here, but we haven't got to that point yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Pat McFadden.
Thank you. Secretary of State, can I take you back to...
Morning, Mr. McFadden.
Good morning. Can I take you back to this question of the resolution that the House is going to be faced with later this year? What will the government do if Parliament doesn't accept that resolution?
Well, if it rejects it? Well, as I say, it's a hypothetical. I don't think we will. I think we intend to bring the best possible negotiated conclusion we can to the House, and then we will make the best case we can. We don't normally lay out what we'll do if we lose in votes, as far as I'm aware.
You said before that if this happens, the deal falls.
Sorry,
You said before if this happens, the deal falls full stop in total. Is that true in all circumstances?
If it's a straightforward defeat of that, I'd expect that to be the case. The deal would fall. Yes, I would think so.
For example, there's an amendment.
If we're unable to carry it forward, then we're unable to carry it forward. You know, and the chairman asked me, will we respect the vote? The answer is the government will respect votes it brings to the House.
What I'm trying to drive at is whether there are any circumstances in which you would go back to the EU on any points. For example, if the resolution were amended to say Parliament requests the government to seek an extension of the Article 50 process to discuss this or do that, is that possible, or would it be the government's position if you vote against this in any way, the whole thing falls? And we leave it there.
I think extend the Article 50 process. You cannot do that unilaterally. For a start.
Sorry, I didn't.
You cannot. So we're both having trouble. You cannot do that unilaterally. I mean, that requires unanimity, both us and the other 27 all together. And so that won't be, you know, if the Parliament asks for something which is impossible, then obviously we can't deliver on it. I'm not really going to be drawn into every possible option and do your work for you in terms of how to draft an amendment to make it most difficult for the government.
Of course, it's not just down to the government, but Parliament can request our government. Yes. And it's not impossible. It is simply that it's not solely in the gift of the government. And those are two different things, aren't they?
Yeah. The which?
It is not impossible to extend Article 50. It is simply not within the gift of the government.
The rules are clear. I mean, you know, if with unanimity it can be extended.
Correct.
Yeah.
So it's not impossible, is it?
Well, it may be impossible. It depends on whether anybody else wants to stop it. I mean, the other side of this argument, you remember, the Walloon Parliament held up a treaty with Canada for some time, and the TTIP options pretty much died off the back of a few countries' objections. So, you know, it may well prove to be impossible. I can't tell you at this point.
On the likely time we've got for this, the Institute for Government produced a report the other week, which you've probably seen, setting out various scenarios. They thought Parliament should have around 5 days to discuss this. Does that seem in the right ballpark?
Well, this is, I mean, I don't know what the timetable will be when we get to this point. I mean, if we have an agreement, as we are intending to, both sides are intending to, in October, then we have what will, I imagine, happen. In the first instance, the Prime Minister will come back and make a statement to the House, and then there would be a vote put. Now, normally speaking, I wouldn't expect that to be immediate, but as I say, it's a matter for the usual channels. I mean, 5 days doesn't sound onerous, but as I say, it's a matter for the usual channels.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State, for coming to give evidence to us today. Could I ask you first just to clarify further whether the withdrawal agreement text that is brought to this House in October will be the final text?
It will be the text we will have negotiated at that time, yes.
So it will be the final text and subject to amendment thereafter if there are amendments that can be brought forward by the House?
The agreement?
Yes.
No, the House will not be able directly to amend the agreement. The agreement is effectively in the form of an international treaty, and you can look up the conventions as well as I can on that.
And will you be looking for approval of both houses of Parliament before proceeding?
That's what we've said.
And what will happen if the House of Lords doesn't pass?
The House of Lords has accepted that it would, if I remember correctly, in one of the debates on Article 50 when this was first raised, that in the event there was a difference of view between the two houses, it would defer to the Commons.
Could I ask you, Secretary of State, you've said that you can't...
So the Commons is a critical vote.
Yes, could I ask you this question? You've said that you can't confirm how long we will have for scrutiny in the autumn. Are you concerned, therefore, that we won't hit the October deadline that you're working to?
No, I don't think so. Bear in mind there are a number of stages in this. I mean, firstly, it is not at all impossible that we'll have debates on the agreement when it's clear but not signed. That's possible. Then you get to your critical, your so-called meaningful vote. Then after that, you have the withdrawal and implementation bill, which will take time and will have within it elements of British law which will need to put into effect the implementation period. So all of these are times in which the House can express its view and indeed, if it chooses to, block the whole thing. So it takes time. That will take time. So that's why I'm not trying to guess. I mean, I haven't sat down with a diary to work out how much time you've got for that particular vote. For then, my aim is to give the House as much time as I can to do all of those things, not just the one vote, but the whole thing.
Do you think you should be sitting down to work out how long the House should have?
I could spend a great deal of time on speculative exercises, which again I don't control all the elements of. And as the chairman said earlier, the achieving of the October position will be dependent on us and on the European Union as well.
The European Parliament has a process of constantly engaging with different nations on priorities.
Say again, sorry.
The European Parliament has a process of constantly engaging with countries on the direction of policy. What process does the government have planned to keep Parliament on board so that there is a very strong chance of this going through Parliament at the end with no surprises?
Do you think that Parliament hasn't debated Brexit enough? Is that the thrust of your question? Because I find it a little bit at odds with reality.
We might have a disagreement about what has been a meaningful debate if there's very little that can actually be changed. I'm just asking this because it struck me as quite a distinction between the way that Guy Verhofstadt and the European Parliament has worked and the process they have of keeping everybody on board. So I'm just wanting to know
which process you're talking about with respect to the European Parliament. Which process of nation-state engagement are you talking about?
In relation to the Brexit subcommittee and how nations are also kept on board in the discussions it proceeds. I'm just wondering whether you've got anything alternative planned so that you can be keeping Parliament on board as we proceed to October.
There are a number of pieces of legislation coming in front of the House. We have had. I mean, the news has been dominated most of the last few months by the progress of the withdrawal bill, both in our House and then in the House of Lords. We have had, of course, select committee hearings like this. And many others. I mean, Lord knows how many my ministers in total have addressed, and not just my ministers, as I said before, people like John Thompson, the HMRC. I mean, there's no absence of information on this in this area, or indeed of government engagement with the House. It happens all the time. I'm just trying to see where it is you think there's a deficiency that needs to be dealt with.
Well, I think that there's also in that whole debate a lot of questions about how Parliament is actually meaningfully engaged in this process, and you'll know that this whole question about meaningful vote, which you've just described as so-called, came about. But if I could ask you this question...
Well, before we do that...
No, Secretary of State, if I could ask you this question.
Right, on time, yeah.
Will there be legal consequences of no deal?
Of no deal? Well, the legal consequences of every outcome, of every single outcome. And indeed, it would also depend on what you mean by no deal. I've said to this committee before, the sort of complete absence of any outcome is unlikely. You might end up with, I think I've used the phrase, a bare bones deal, or you might end up with a whole series of bilateral deals. This is where we are looking at tiny probabilities here. I mean, I do not think no deal is a significant probability at all. I think the massively higher probability is a deal. But in the event it goes down that other route, nobody wants that. No other country wants it. I mean, you know, talk to Spain, they don't want their aviation issues blocked. You talk to
I agree nobody wants it, but in the event, as you've described the process, and if Parliament does not agree to the deal, then would we proceed with no deal, beyond WTO rules, etc., etc.? There would be legal consequences, I imagine. Could you just outline some of what those legal consequences would be?
Well, I'm trying hard to see where you're trying to get with this, because, I mean, as I say, there are legal consequences in terms of the relationship between nations, between ourselves and the European Union, of every single permutation. So which aspect of legal consequences are you driving at?
Would there be changes to the way we would trade, and status of legal contracts? that would need to be worked through?
Well, if it was an absolute no deal, there'll be a tariff arrangement in place. That's a legal consequence, I guess.
And if I could ask you, Secretary of State, normally when we seek a change in the law, if the government brings something to Parliament and maybe to update existing law, and that vote is not passed, what happens to existing law?
It stays as it is.
And in the scenario that Parliament does not pass a withdrawal agreement and we move forward with no deal, which has legal consequences, do you believe that would be
But this is why
constitutionally challengeable, Secretary of State?
That's for others to judge. It's not for me to give advice on how to challenge the government. That's why I was about to intervene on you earlier, and I didn't because we're trying to save time. And say, well, this is the problem of using the phrase meaningful vote. Meaningful vote is a phrase which avoids the choices being put. Is what people who use the phrase meaningful vote saying, well, we want the right to reverse the referendum. A referendum which was passed by a 4 times majority in both houses, right? Are we seeking to reverse Article 50, which said we will leave? That's a piece of law. That's the piece of law which will stand in the event that you overturn a deal. So those are the sorts of legal consequences. That's what you're driving at.
This final question, Secretary of State, just going through that logic. Is it possible that no deal and proceeding with no deal without a vote of this Parliament would not be legal?
Without a vote of Parliament. In the circumstance you're talking about, we've passed the referendum bill massively. We've had the referendum. You've passed Article 50 massively, which actually is the very, very short bill, very easy to comprehend, 137-word bill, which basically says we are triggering Article 50, namely we are leaving. Done, by the way, after a court case saying that's the way effectively you should do it. Then where is the and then the House says we don't want that deal. I mean, there's quite a lot of votes in that. That's not being passed without the intention of the House. That's being passed with the explicit intention of the House, which is why I've been very, very stark about what this means all the way through. I've never stood behind any form of strange words over this, unlike others. I've been very plain about it.
Would you be able to come back if I could?
We are going to have to move on.
I know. So I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Good morning.
I wanted to come back to the transition deal and the issue around sincere cooperation in trade deals, because there's an exemption to allow trade deals in spite of sincere cooperation. And I wonder if you could explain how that will work, what the opportunities will be, and what the limitations may be, particularly in relation to our activities on international bodies.
Well, this was, in essence, the biggest single ask on the British side in starting down the route for the implementation period, transition period, you choose your phrase. And the reason for that was that we were denied the right to do that by being a part of the common commercial policy and also by a duty of sincere cooperation. We couldn't even start down the route properly under the duty of sincere cooperation. What this does explicitly is allow us to negotiate and sign such deals, but not enter into force. That seemed to me to be reasonable, because if you opened up a free trade deal, let's say we had 0 tariffs with some other trade partner, they could export products to here, and then in theory people could export them on without hindrance to the European Union. So it created a great loophole in their external tariff. So that was in effect the offer we made, and it's essentially been accepted. The advantage of it, I spoke earlier about the huge size of the trade growth in the rest of the world. The story of the last 30 years has been a spectacular growth in world trade, a fantastic effect in the chairman's old stamping ground on world poverty, and also huge opportunities for a country like ours with our world network, our English language, and all the various other competitive advantages we have. So that's what it's aimed to do. And the aim is explicit. It's to be able to get off to a racing start once we are formally concluded the whole process, including implementation period, of having trade arrangements in place. And we saw Justin Trudeau just last week saying he wants to be first in the queue.
And will the government be able to act independently in relation to the prospect of trade deals in international bodies such as the WTO, or will we be bound by sincere cooperation in such organisations?
Well, we're in the middle of discussion with the Union over the ongoing trade arrangements, which they have negotiated previously, and how we fit within those. But other than that, I see no reason why we should be restrained.
And is it your hope and expectation that the first trade deals, having been signed in the implementation or transition period, will come into force the day after we have left?
Yeah, well, that's my hope.
That's your hope?
I can't tell you at the moment whether it's an expectation, because we're not really far enough down the road.
And there's one concern with the two proposals for customs with the European Union, that neither of them is likely to be ready for day one after we've left.
Neither of which, sorry, I missed the first one.
Of the maximum facilitation and the special customs partnership. Is there a risk that the government may be saying we need to stay in the customs union for an interim period, which would obviously hamper our ability to implement any trade deals that we'd signed?
No, I mean the problem here. I mean, at the end of the day, you have the option of varying effectively the sampling rate when you are checking things coming into the country. And bear in mind, our customs operation is checking things coming into our country. The bigger risk from that point of view is the other way, is what the French customs authorities, the Dutch and others, and we're talking to them already to try and facilitate that. But no, I do not expect the solution to that to be extension of membership of the customs union. I view that, on my part, as a failure.
Thank you, Secretary of State.
Okay, thank you. Sammy Wilson.
That's it. Last week you started the discussions around the future trade arrangements. Yeah. There have been rumours that those have been suspended because of the issue of the Irish border. Have they been suspended, or has the Irish border issue, and especially option C, been an impediment to them moving forward?
No, I mean, clearly it is dominating quite a lot of the discussion. But no, I saw the report you referred to, and the Commission itself explicitly said that was not true, and we've had no indication it was true. So no, we don't think that's the case.
Well, certainly the Irish government and the EU have said there has to be progress on all three options for the Irish border. What do you? Obviously, the government has put forward its proposals for options A and B. There's a stalemate with option C at present because of the way in which it has been interpreted. What do you see needs to be done to move that particular discussion on? Well,
there's a difference of view, as you described at the start. There's a difference of view on option C. I mean, what the Commission proposed was simply not acceptable under its, indeed not acceptable, I think, to the main opposition parties either. I mean, certainly not the Labour Party. I mean, I'm not sure what's got in that position is. So that's not a tolerable one, because it basically breaks up the United Kingdom, or does effectively starts a process which will break up the United Kingdom. Our interpretation of what full alignment means is different at the moment. We think it means basically outcome alignment, and we can give examples of how that can be done, even under existing circumstances. We all of us think, including the Irish government, that the best option is option A. And option A, of course, hangs on how comprehensive and effective a free trade agreement you have. If you don't have a tariff or a quota between ourselves and any of the 27 member states, including the Republic of Ireland, then that makes all of the customs agreement options easier. Doesn't take them away, but it makes them easier. So, I mean, you'll know this better than me. In Northern Ireland, when people cross the border, they cross an excise border, they cross a VAT, they cross a tax border, they cross a currency border. And for companies trading across that, they have to deal with that now, and pay those differences in excise or VAT or whatever it might be. And so that would be any financial difference. The issue then will resolve down to regulatory issues, and how we get mutual recognition of regulatory issues, and rules of origin. things that come into our country, taking up Mr. Rees-Mogg's point before, if things come into Britain or to Northern Ireland, which are from countries with no tariff, which otherwise will pay a tariff going into a 27 state, then we have to find a way of dealing with that. Those are the issues which will become paramount in the circumstances in which we get a free trade agreement, which in my view is a probability well north of 90%.
I think that any sensible person would accept that getting the free trade arrangement in place will eradicate the need for option C anyhow. But given, and this is the difficulty I have, given that the free trade arrangement and the bones of the free trade arrangement are not likely to be in place by October, and indeed the Irish government have said that they want this issue resolved by June, at least the foreign minister has said that. Given that the details of the free trade arrangement are not likely to be in place by October, how then can we have or even see the possibility of the issue being resolved as part of option 1 if the details of option 1 are not going to be known by October?
I think the first thing to understand is what we mean by what will be in place by October. There's been sort of people say, oh, it's a political agreement, whatever. It's going to be substantive. It has to be substantive. I think it has to be substantive from the British Parliament's point of view. British Parliament, we're voting for the withdrawal agreement. We'll be voting for a bill of 35 to 39 billion pounds. You know, it will want to know on the other side what we're getting in exchange, and it will be very, very. I mean, I think the hardest time I'm going to have in October is actually dealing with people saying, "What have we got for this?" Yeah? So, and I think the European Union understands that too, and so it will be very substantive. And what we're talking about here is central to it. Is absolutely central to it. The free trade agreement, mutual recognition of standards, and how you deal with rules of origin are central to the future economic partnership. So we have to have that resolved by October, substantively. Technical details, maybe not. But bear in mind that this issue then this issue in practical terms only bites in January 2021, not because of the implementation period. And I know I've come under accusations of setting up a vassal state from the member next door to you, but the reason for the implementation period is to allow us to go from substantive to agreed details before it starts, and then during the period of the implementation period, ratification and practical effect. That's why that sequence works like that.
And for the record, is it still the government's position that if there is an insistence on option C being finalised by October, that it will not include either different arrangements for Northern Ireland or indeed total regulatory alignment for the whole of the UK?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Christopher Chope.
Can I follow up on that last question, because the interaction between options A and C? Because if the facts giving rise to whether option A is going to be workable or not are not going to be established until October, why is it that we are being told that we've got to decide by June whether we're going to go for option A, B or C?
Yeah, well, I think a number of things are happening. We're in the middle of a negotiation. One of the things that happens in negotiations is people try to set up deadlines, sometimes artificial deadlines, to put pressure on one element of the negotiation which they think is in their favour. And so we've seen a little bit of that. But that's why I refer back to the Taoiseach, to Mr Varadkar's comments, when he said that it's better to have a good deal in October than any deal in June. You know? We do not see June as a sort of artificial timetable. Now, let me be clear. We're going to try to get an agreed form of words on option C as quickly as we can, but not to an artificial timetable.
And one of the elements of any agreement would be to try and tease out exactly what is meant by option C. And there's been correspondence between the chairman and you about the work that's being done on this, which is called a mapping exercise. Can you tell us the latest position in relation to that mapping exercise? What further work has still to be done?
Oh, it's still underway. I don't have the detail of that in my head, Mr. Chairman. I will write to you on that. The chairman wrote to me just this week, and in fact I just sent the letter back.
I've got it here.
Oh, you got it there. And there's, I mean, I can let you know what that detail is. I'm hoping it's going to be over quite quickly. We are going to tell the European Commission, my officials may already have done it, that we want this to be transparent and be published as soon as we can. And I'm going to make sure that this committee sees a copy of it all before it actually goes into public domain.
So what are we talking about? Weeks or days?
Well, you asked me to put a guess on top of a guess. I don't know, but we will write back to you very very quickly in the next day or so, and give you an idea of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that the answer you gave to the chairman is obviously very carefully worded, as all civil servants' letters are. But it says.
You're trying to suggest I didn't write my own letter.
Well, I'm sure you signed it. It's got your signature on it. But it says further work has been agreed to finalise it. I'm hopeful that we can conclude this soon. Mm-hmm. And then you go on to say, well, it's a joint UK-EU exercise.
I am dependent on the Commission and on the Irish government, so that's why I'm not going to give you a guess at this point in time.
So you're just blocking us on that, but you do say in the last.
No, I'm not blocking you. I'll write back to you very very soon. Don't worry.
Again, and then can I ask you finally about the last paragraph, last sentence of your letter, which says, I will also ensure the committee receives sight of the mapping exercise documentation prior to wider publication. How is that going to work, bearing in mind that you also say in the letter that this belongs collectively to the EU?
It does, but we'll make
UK.
that point to them. They have their own groups that they need to brief as well. You know, the Brexit Committee of the European Parliament and so on. So I don't think that'll be a problem.
So this could actually, it might be sensible to remove that June constraint and say, well, sort out the mapping exercise, sort out the trade deal, and leave all this until October.
Generally speaking, in all of this negotiation, I find that when we get into the detail and work through the detail, it tends to unblock things rather than block things. Not always, but generally it tends to unblock things rather than block things. And that's what I would hope will happen here.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, Secretary
Morning
of
again,
State.
Mr. Kinnock.
Hello. During the course of this session this morning, you've made two, I think, very important statements. You've said that, on the one hand, the motion that will be brought before us in the autumn will be amendable. But on the other hand, you've said, if the House rejects the motion falls. Now, both of those statements can't be true, can they? You've said, if it's amendable,
well, if it votes it down,
then by definition
if it votes it down, it falls. If it amends it, it's amended. For past amendment. So what's the problem? They're different outcomes.
Okay, so just to be clear then, if the House amends the motion and instructs the government to, for example, go back to Brussels and negotiate a different deal to the one that was put before us, the government would respect the will of the House and would go back to Brussels to do that.
I'm not going to speculate on amendments that have not even yet been laid, let alone passed by the House.
But Secretary of State, you've said that a few times this morning.
Yeah.
Surely you must appreciate the risk of us heading towards a constitutional crisis here. And surely it's the responsibility of the government to have scenarios in mind so that it's ready to respond when the House does vote.
The first responsibility of the government is to promote and defend the national interest, which means not put yourself in positions where you create options which are advantageous to the other side of the negotiation, for example. That's one of the reasons I have in the past argued in this committee against a referendum, because that would create an incentive on the other side to give us a bad deal, so that they might get a referendum which keeps us in. And similarly, I'm not going to give advice on how to create circumstances which may undermine the government's negotiating position, as that might do. I don't know what you've got in mind, but it might.
All I have in mind is that if a meaningful amendment is to be on the table and the government is to respect that amendment, which by definition is what makes it meaningful, a very meaningful amendment would be that we want to have a deal with the European Union, but we don't think the deal that the government has brought back from Brussels is satisfactory, and we therefore instruct the government to go back and get another deal. Are you saying to us today, then, confirming the government would do that?
I'm
if
saying
so
to you, I'm not going
instructed
to.
by the
I'm
House?
saying to you, in terms of the reasons I've just outlined, I'm not going to speculate on what the government will do in response to an amendment which has not yet been laid, let alone passed by the House. As a practical matter, I'm not entirely sure how much force a government sent back with its tail between its legs by Parliament would have in such a negotiation, but that's a different matter. What you're making is a constitutional point, and you can draw your own conclusions on it. I'm not going to speculate on it.
Thank you very much. Just turning then to the political declaration on the future relationship, the post-transition relationship. I think most people would accept that in many ways that will be the most important aspect of what we vote on in the autumn. Can you say a bit more about how much detail you think will be in that political declaration, given that it's such an important vote for us? What do you think would be a satisfactory level of detail and information for MPs to make an informed choice?
Quite a lot, to be honest. I mean, the chairman referred earlier to reports of me saying, well, we're talking about 40 plus parallel strands. One of the reasons is, I want us to have, well, not just to be able to face Parliament, but to know ourselves what the substantive conclusion is in all those different areas. Now, I've just talked about the substantive issue of a free trade agreement and mutual recognition, which would be a very important, almost central to the whole thing. There will be a whole series of other areas where we will have issues which may not be central, but they're massively important. Aviation, data, nuclear materials, how we handle that. And some of this, of course, is being handled in the House as well in other legislation going through the House. The nuclear materials one has already been through the Commons stages. So there will be a large, we intend a large amount of substantive material on this, basically decisions. I mean, that's why I avoided the phrase political declaration, because it sounds rather woolly. A statement by the Council on a whole series of decisions as to what the future economic partnership will look like. And I highlighted earlier in my comments to the Chairman that Angela Merkel has said herself she wants to see a lot of detail around that too, because they're of course going to have to present the withdrawal agreement to their own parliaments as well, and they'll want to know that nobody wants a pig in a poker list. Nobody wants any more uncertainty than is absolutely necessary. The difficulty we have, of course, it will not be ratified until after we leave. That's where the area of doubt comes. Not in, I think, in the amount we will achieve by October.
But isn't the weakness in your logic that there is an umbilical cord from going from the Northern Ireland issue to the political declaration? So the future relationship post-transition is to a large extent going to be determined by what can be agreed around Northern Ireland. And so until the Northern Ireland issue has been resolved, meaningful discussions on the political declaration cannot really start. And in that case, is it really likely that we're going to have that level of detail by October? Aren't you fundamentally being held back because you've not yet found a solution to the Northern Ireland issue?
No, that reverses the logic, Mr. Kinnock. We have said since the beginning, indeed, when we were at this stage of the first round of negotiations, organising the four strands, we were very clear we wanted Northern Ireland in there because we view both the circumstance of Northern Ireland and protection of the Belfast, of the Good Friday Agreement, and indeed, bluntly, the protection of our closest neighbour, Ireland, as fundamentally important. The economy of the Republic of Ireland is fundamentally important.
Yeah.
So that means it's important. But it doesn't mean that the best route to solution is via option C. Indeed, when I had a conversation with Michel about this before March, back in Downing Street, I said, actually, we should do them all in parallel, but the one that everybody wants to work, and I include the Taoiseach in this, and I think even Mr. Coveney, who may have said some other things which I don't agree with, but I think the general view is that a free trade agreement will make the Northern Irish border issue much, much easier to deal with, but also will protect both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland's markets and economic position, and so they have an interest in doing that.
Secretary of State, I absolutely understand those arguments, but the British government has made it clear throughout this process that there is an integral, intrinsic relationship between the Northern Ireland issue and the future relationship post-transition. Yes. And that the Northern Ireland issue is one of the three big-ticket issues under the divorce piece of this negotiations. Yes. You then move on to the future relationship post-transition. So, by its own admission, the British government has been saying, we can't sort out the future relationship until we've sorted out Northern Ireland. And if that is the case, and Northern Ireland still isn't sorted, is it realistic that we're going to have a very detailed political declaration given the very short time frame that we have?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, the thing to be aware of course, is that the option C, in essence, is almost a sort of reserve parachute, the final backstop guarantee, really, for all elements of this. But nobody sees that as the most desirable outcome. Everybody sees the free trade agreement, option A, as the most desirable outcome, and I think that's true across the board, maybe with the exception of one or two people who want to keep us in a single market at almost at any price, but I don't think many are there. So, so I do not take your view. I think it can be done in parallel. Indeed, we're intending to do it in parallel. That's part of the reason, it's part of the outcome of our 45-plus parallel strategy.
Thank you. One final question. Will the political declaration be sufficiently detailed that the OBR would be able to make an assessment of it prior to members of Parliament having a vote on the draft agreement?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. Let me just think through for a second. Bear in mind, we are going to provide an economic assessment ourselves. The OBR is required by the 2011 Act, I've forgotten its title now, something like Budget Responsibility and National Audit Act, to make 2 forecasts a year based on government policy. And so it will, and I'm not sure quite how the timing of that will fall. So I don't know the immediate answer. However, I mean, the simple truth is, to come back to almost the underlying point in much of this discussion earlier. Much of this will be in, well, nearly all of it will be in a public domain in the run-up to the point of the outcome. Up to the point of October, and of course, both the OBR and the National Audit Office have access to all government data anyway, so I don't see that being a problem. But let me have a think on that. Okay. If I'm wrong about that, I'll write to you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Howard Williams.
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Good morning.
The reports that we've seen are that you have comprehensively rejected option C. And I just wondered, you've said yourself that you agree that there's a need to include legal and tax detailing the backstop solution for the Irish question. Do you have a backstop of your own, and would you possibly share
let me sort of start with, okay, I don't like to correct people, it's correction. We haven't rejected option C, we've just rejected the Commission's first attempt at it, because it was one which both sides of the House have said no British government could accept. We will come up with our own wording on it. We're working on that as we speak, and we will come up with our own wording on it. Now, then we'll have an argument about that, no doubt, I'm sure.
And you will be sharing it with this committee?
I'll be sharing it with the entire, everybody, I think, at some point. But not in the first round of negotiation. We've got to have some of the negotiation first. Yeah?
Yeah, well, you said earlier on that the Commission's comprehensive, systematic and forensic annihilation was their their opening gambit, as it were, in the negotiations, I understand. Now, can I ask you about option B, which is that the United Kingdom will propose specific solutions to address the unique circumstances of the island of Ireland? Now, you said a moment ago, I think, that you wanted option A, which is an UK-EU deal.
Yeah.
Can you just comment on B there, which means, it sounds to me like a specific Northern Ireland only solution?
Well, no,
to this.
it's not. It's if we have some deal which is not the sort of free trade agreement approach that clearly we're playing for. I mean, look, there are a whole series. I mean, when Mr. Chope was asking me about the various strands, there are a whole series of issues which have got quite specific reference in them. The single electricity market, for example, is a very important issue which is almost unique to the island of Ireland in terms of its importance and structure. So we probably want to do something on that. On agribusiness is massive, and so we'll have to sort of think about how we deal with that too. And of course it's the most difficult because you've got cross-border farms and Lord knows what else. So there are a variety of sort of issues, specific issues of that sort of nature, which we try to resolve in the event of another deal. But without knowing what the other deal is, I can make speculative comments to you, which is what I'm just doing, but I can't actually tell you in detail.
But therefore,
that is the one which really does have to follow after whatever the deal looks
so
like.
that's in principle, you see that there might be a possibility of specific issues for Northern Ireland being sorted by a specific answer for Northern Ireland, which doesn't apply to the rest of the United Kingdom.
Well, I mean, the single electricity market, for example, doesn't apply to the rest. You know, you've got in the island of Ireland, you've got a single phytosanitary or epidemiological space. We have had since the BSE crisis, from memory. I was the Europe Minister then. That's why I got my first round of grey hair. So you know, you've got already some specific things, and we'd have to look at that.
Can you tell me, are there pairs of countries anywhere where there are two customs regimes for trade between them, and two potentially competing customs regimes? For in this case, you know, I'm just concerned that lots of attention is the north-south trade issue, and there is a great deal of east-west trade.
Massive amount of east-west. I mean, massive amount of east-west. And
it's
even
more important.
Oh, I mean, I forgot what the multiplier is, but it's huge. I mean, you're talking about $1 billion a week is a trade between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland, and nearly all of it's east, as what you term east-west in this context. But even some of the north-south, or the Northern Ireland back to the mainland of Great Britain, is through the south as well. I mean, one of the primary routes is effectively from Belfast to Dublin, across the Irish Sea to Holyhead, and then to the south of England. And it's a trip that starts at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and has to be concluded by between 2 and 4 the next morning. There's sort of perishable goods and so on. So there are a whole series of issues like that which we would have to resolve in a non-FTA outcome.
So option B is a possible option, you think?
Again, look, I think the free trade agreement, I mean, partly because it's not just wishful thinking on my part. If you go back and look at the Council guidelines, you'll see they want a tariff-free arrangement, which is the keystone in the arch, really, of this. And so I think that's massively, the overwhelmingly probable outcome. So I don't think options B and C are at all likely to be needed. But nevertheless, we've undertaken to do them, so we'll do them. You know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andrea Jenkins.
Question. It's following on from what Jacob was discussing about the implementation period. Obviously, the Prime Minister and yourself secured an agreement with the EU for the implementation period to December 2020 at the March Council. From the UK perspective, what was the most notable result from these negotiations?
Well, as you are following on from Mr. Rees-Mogg, because actually what he talked about was the most notable result. I mean, the big part, I mean, look, the referendum was not primarily decided on economic matters. It was decided on control of our own destiny. That was what it was really about. I mean, but nevertheless, the one big economic upside, I mean, there's a small upside in terms of some regulatory efficiency, but there's the one big upside is the improving our access to non-European global markets, and the ability, releasing Liam effectively to go off and actually sign the deals, not just talk about them, but sign the deals, is incredibly important. And we can't do that at the moment. So that is an enormously important outcome, enormously.
Okay, thank you very much. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
The UK government have sought the Scottish Parliament's legislative consent to the EU withdrawal bill under the Sewell Convention. What will the UK government do when the Scottish Parliament withholds that consent, as it has said it will do yesterday?
Well, we are actually still we're still talking to the Scottish Government on the amendments to Clause 11, as you know, and we have been working very hard. I mean, you know, I'm almost a fifth columnist in this government in terms of devolution, in terms of promoting devolution. So I was slightly disappointed that we didn't get agreement with the Scottish Government. I thought we got quite close. Now, this is a matter primarily for the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, whose responsibility this is. We managed, in case the committee have not followed it, the Welsh Government have essentially agreed with the changes we have proposed, and we're still talking to the Scottish Government, I think, and we will be certainly up until I think 5 o'clock this evening when the last possible time for laying the amendment is, and I hope we'll find a mechanism to get agreement between us still.
You see, yesterday, Mike Russell, who you know well now, I think.
Indeed. Yeah.
Made a statement in the Scottish
buddies almost.
Yeah, made a statement in the Scottish Parliament that the amendments in draft to Clause 11, which the Scottish Government had seen, would not be acceptable. So I think we can say at best it's a very real possibility now that the Scottish Parliament will not give its legislative consent to the withdrawal bill. Now, it seems to me that if that happens, there'll be 3 options. That will either stop the bill in its tracks, it will delay its progress, or the UK government could simply ignore the withheld consent, ride roughshod over the wishes of the Scottish Parliament and proceed. Are you able to help us with which 3 of those options will be taken if consent is withheld?
Again, you're asking me to speculate. What I would prefer that we do is we continue our discussions with the Scottish Government today, and if need be thereafter, and try to get to a position where we've got an amicable agreement. And I'm not going to colour that by offering up suggestions. What was the phrase you used? Roughshod? There's certainly not words I would use.
Okay. Well, that's quite encouraging, really, because it's been reported in the press this morning that Theresa May has said that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, indeed, can take or leave the amendments. But you're indicating that there's further room for negotiation about these amendments.
I'm just saying that the conversation, I imagine, is still going on. I mean, I'm not actually party to that conversation at the moment. So I'm giving you my speculation, frankly, rather than a fact. Okay. But that's what my hope is.
Can I ask you about the transition period and Article 6 of the withdrawal agreement? Because at present, and the Court of Justice in particular I want to ask you about, at present there's 2 British judges on the Court of Justice, one from the English legal tradition and one from the Scottish legal tradition. And during the transition period, the domestic legal systems of the UK will continue to be subject to the full force of the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice, whether in relation to litigation between individual parties or indeed in relation to enforcement action against the UK. That being the case, why did you agree to Article 6 of the withdrawal agreement, which means that there will be no British judges on the Court of Justice during the transition period? Why did you agree to that?
Because we're then a third country. The interesting, there's been a bit of debate even on this committee about whether this is an implementation or transition period, or indeed an extension of membership of the Union. It's not an extension of membership of the Union, and for those 2 years, despite the scathing comments of Mr. Rees-Mogg, we will live with some imperfections, but it will not be massively problematic for us. I don't imagine the European Court will behave in a particularly different manner.
What puzzles me about this is it seems to be the objection to the Court of Justice all along has been, I think, to paraphrase the words of others, that it's a foreign court. But of course, at the moment, it's a court where the legal systems of the United Kingdom are represented, in the sense that there are judges produced by our domestic legal systems. But during the transition period, it will be a foreign court, won't it? Because there won't be any British judges on it any longer. But the UK legal systems will still be fully subject to its jurisdiction.
It sounds to me like you're in full alliance with Mr. Rees-Mogg. You're going to come around accusing me of creating a vassal state again. Look, you never heard me describe this problem as because it's a foreign court. After all, I'm not an antagonist of the European Court of Human Rights, which would fulfil the same.
If I can explain where I'm coming from here, others, legal academics and commentators, have suggested that this may pose rule of law problems, in that we will be fully subject to the court's jurisdiction. No third country is fully subject to the court's jurisdiction, so there is an anomalous position here. So we'll be fully subject to the court's jurisdiction, yet there'll be no judges from our legal traditions. Would it not have been possible for you to seek a compromise whereby during the transition period the British judges would remain in place?
We did raise that issue. Didn't get very far.
So you agreed to there being no British judges during the transition period, despite the fact
we will agree to all elements of the withdrawal agreement when we sign it off, assuming we do, assuming Parliament allows us to.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Secretary of State, after March 2019, when we went the party to EU structures and decision-making, Michel Barnier has told us that he wants to see elements of the future arrangements, which he characterises as 4 pillars, in place as soon as possible during the transition phase. And I think he's particularly thinking of foreign security and defence arrangements. But given the sensitivity and urgency often involved in, say, home affairs, justice and police decision-making, would it not make sense for the architecture for really all the pillars except the future trade agreement to be in place as soon as possible during the transition? And wouldn't it also be incredibly useful for both parties to have architecture and arrangements for dialogue on financial issues, where stability of financial markets is so important to both of us?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Well, let me start by just in terms of how fast we can get it into place. I mean, the truth is, for all of these areas, we want to do it as quickly as possible. And certainly for security, defence, home affairs issues, as fast as we can. So we share that aim. The thing that will slow that down, well, if anything slows it down, will be agreement on some critical areas of how it works. I mean, things like jurisdiction of the European Court, to come back to Ms. Cherry's point, issues of whether the European arrest warrant will work and so on. So we agree. We want to see this, or how it will work. We agree that we want to see this in place as soon as we can. In financial, are you thinking financial regulations? To get you to elaborate your question, because it's a fascinating idea. I'd not thought of it before. So.
Yes, certainly all the financial regulators, I think, made it clear when we took evidence from them last week that they would welcome this arrangement. Indeed, hinted that there had been discussions of a similar sort around it. I just wondered whether that was
not in terms of the pillars. There hasn't. There's been some talk already between regulators. I mean, one of the things which will undoubtedly be necessary will be cooperation over financial regulation in terms of stability management, really. As indeed there already is at pretty much at a global level, of course. I mean, when we have crises, the Fed talks to the bank, talks to the ECB, and so on. But it's an interesting thought, and let me take it away and think about it, because we have to structure somehow how the future financial relationships will work. Thing to bear in mind, I would say, this is literally off the top of my head, is that one of the areas which makes agreements mixed agreements is when the national stability is engaged. One of the reasons that financial matters have to go through a mixed agreement is because every country has a potential carve-out on financial stability. So it might trigger a mixed agreement ratification procedure. But I'll think on it.
And the other thing that I think would be incredibly reassuring for businesses in particular is the amount of detail on what the EU tends to call, I think, the thematic pillar, all the detailed issues on aviation, chemicals, nuclear power and so on. Do you anticipate that there will be enough clarity on all of those by the time it comes to the vote on the withdrawal agreement in October?
Yes, because I mean, my argument to the Commission has been, we all want the withdrawal agreement to go through, but from the British point of view, I mean, at the very least, we're talking about a major sum of money, but we're also talking about major elements of migration control for the interim period and so on. All of these elements are things that the British Parliament will want to see the quid pro quo for.
Yeah. And so the only issue, in a sense, where parliamentarians won't have complete clarity before the vote in October will be the Northern Ireland issue, given that really we hope to find the solution through the comprehensive free trade agreement.
Well, no, I don't think that will be a lack of clarity either, because once you have got the in principle agreement on, let's say, mutual recognition, and then and on tariffs. And some sort of customs agreement to minimise the friction on the border. That's the point at which we'll be able to turn around and say, yeah, on that basis, option A will work like this, and we'll be working on that from now. Don't think we'll wait until it's done. We've already got work on this. Indeed, the so-called maximum facilitation option is really based around that thesis. So we will. I don't think Parliament will have major doubts in any of these areas. The issue will be how the detailed legal text, which will not be there.
Indeed. Thank you.
Now, what time do you actually have to leave?
Well, I have to be at the meeting at 11. So
and how long is it going to take you to get there?
Let's run till 10:02, shall we?
What?
Let's run till 10:02, shall we?
Right, okay, well then they're going to be very quick questions from colleagues who haven't yet been...
And I'll try to be quick answers.
Yeah, no, if you can. I'm going to start with Jeremy Lefroy. And a single question and a single answer would be really helpful to get the others in.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning. Last week, when we met in the City, we were told that the two major issues for financial services were contracts and data, and particularly contracts which extended over whether it's the 31st or 29th of March 2019 or the 31st of December 2020. What work is being done on that? Because clearly this is absolutely fundamental to an area which is extremely important to all parts of the United Kingdom in future.
Yeah, well, a great deal of work is going on that, mostly within the Treasury, as you can imagine. But that's in play. Data is an even bigger issue in terms of the actual resolution. Because it's going to be the probably the single biggest area of intergovernmental cooperation, stroke discussion, stroke legal effect of anything that we're doing. And if you want a measure of that, look back even at the American circumstances when the safe harbour arrangements were struck down by the European Court in the Schrems case, and there's a second Schrems case underway. So they're both very, very front and centre of our activity.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Emma Reynolds.
A quick question of clarification. Good morning. On something you said earlier, the backstop option for the border on the island of Ireland. Of full alignment. You mentioned something earlier that I would like you to clarify. You said that I think you said there may be some disagreement between the UK government and the EU, and you talked about outcome alignment. Can you describe the nature of the disagreement that you're referring to?
We do not see full alignment as harmonisation. You know, the same rules. We see it as in outcome terms. And to give you a sort of simple, very, very mundane example, we already have some degree of mutual recognition of other elements between North and South. On something as mundane as prescriptions from North and South, they're recognised both sides of the border. And what we're looking towards is a mutual recognition stroke outcome alignment. So the biggest area of regulation in terms of North-South trade is almost certainly agriculture, in terms of difficulty and difficulty in volumes. And we may well see changes in over time, slowly, in agricultural regulation, but at no point are we aiming to see a reduction in our animal health standards, for example. At no point are we going to see a reduction, being the country we are, a reduction in our animal welfare standards. So we expect, as it were, to have alignment to mean as good as and recognisable as good as what's happening in the South.
Sorry, but just to appreciate, on the EU side, is the understanding, however, that full alignment means keeping the same regulations in those areas?
If you look at their first proposal, in effect, it looked like keeping the Northern Ireland inside the single market, which would be exactly that. That's complete harmonisation. You know. So yes, there is a difference which we will no doubt negotiate out in the next month or two.
Okay.
Thank you.
Secretary of State, the interaction in terms of legislative procedure that we've been discussing has been in relation to the withdrawal bill and the withdrawal and implementation bill. But actually there are, I calculate, 11 bills on the go, or not on the go, and 4 of them are not on the go: animal welfare, agriculture, immigration, fisheries, and of course the withdrawal and implementation bill haven't even been started. Of the others, the trade bill and the taxation bill seem to have been sort of lost in the ether somewhere, and no one quite knows when they're coming back. On top of these 11 bills, we think, are we still on for 800 to 1,000 SIs? Mm-hmm. I don't think I'm unfair in saying that, you know, a lot of people are saying we're kind of winging it. And is there going to be some element of discipline put into this legislative process and some idea of when we're meant to be doing what?
Yeah, well, the first thing is winging it is unfair, but there's undoubtedly the case that we're having to cope with changes as we go along. Even I mean, to give you one example, you're right, 800 to 1,000 SIs, most of which, not all of which, some of which will apply to the beginning of the implementation period, but a significant proportion needs to apply to the latter part. But take SIs alone. We have just agreed in the process of the withdrawal bill through the Commons and now going through the Lords to have sifting arrangements in place for SIs, which will decide, or not decide, but certainly recommend what happens to an SI if we propose a negative and the House thinks it should be a positive, which will of course change the timetable and so on. So we can't just sort of draw up a sort of lovely timetable. We never have with SIs, as you well know from your own time at Justice and so on. So yeah, there's a lot to do. I mean, we're taking 45 years of law and putting it into our legal system in about 3 years, all told, you know, at the stretch. Some of this needs to be done earlier, prior to the actual implementation period, but much of it will actually tend towards the end. So we've got a little more time than you think. You're right. I think at the moment, my count was 6 at the moment, including the withdrawal bill in play, and issues like immigration, the immigration bill, can't really start until we have the Migration Advisory Council report, which is not coming until September. And you know, we've said all along we want to do this on the basis of what's been the national interest, and we need that report in place before we do that. It's been an interim report. We've got to wait for the second one. So no, we're not winging it, but we are having to accommodate different changes as we go along, and there may be other changes in the withdrawal agreement, which in turn precipitate the need for new SIs. That's why one of the more controversial elements of the withdrawal bill was Clause 9, where we're taking the right to actually use SIs for withdrawal-related issues. Otherwise, most of them, nearly all of them, are simply taking EU law and putting it into British law with the necessary clarifications, that's all. Does that answer?
To paraphrase you from last time, all that legislation, that was then, this is now, and time's running out. On which subject? Vera Hophouse.
Secretary of State, you and the government have said on a number of occasions EU citizens shouldn't be worried about the settled status process. However,
shouldn't be worried about
the settled status process. But there continue to be, and the difference between the two processes they're worried about, either an application or a registration process. If it's an application process, the application can be refused and there's no proper appeal process. Registration, the ball would be in the government's court to positively declare why somebody could not agree with something. Could you clarify whether it would be a registration or an application process?
Well, it's an application process, but let me say this. There is going to be in place an appeal process for anybody who's turned down. That's going to be there, and there will be the Independent Monitoring Authority, which will oversee this. This is not something we've had in terms of managing migration before. A body whose job is to make sure that these people are treated properly. All right?
But a registration process would be much more reassuring for EU citizens. So if you wanted to allay worries about EU citizens...
If I may, Chairman, I'll write on this, because I think this is an interesting point, but I really take
It's a very important point, and I think what EU citizens will be looking for is an assurance, given the Windrush scandal, that no EU citizen who has been here is going to get letters like that because they lack documentation. I'm particularly thinking of elderly relatives who are living with their sons and daughters here, who won't be on council tax, they won't have a national insurance number. Can you give us an assurance that they're not going to get the same treatment that the Windrush citizens
I will, at the risk of being mildly self-righteous, I'll point you to my own speeches early on in this process, where I said our treatment of the European citizens in the UK will be a moral issue. It was a moral imperative, and that's how we've treated it. And that's what we intend to do, sir.
One final point of clarification on something you said earlier. You referred to automatic number plate recognition when talking about technology and the Northern Ireland border. Now, you did say on the Andrew Marr programme that cameras would not form part of the solution. Could you just clarify? There's no suggestion of cameras on the border?
No. I was just reflecting what's already there, which is back inside. Or I was just reflecting what's already in each country, back inside the country. Nothing on the border.
Well, that's already there?
It's already there, yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, can I just say to you in conclusion, thank you for coming today, but there are others who definitely wanted to ask questions, and can I repeat, it's not satisfactory to be told, having fixed a date, having taken time for your office to be able to find, and we recognise all the pressures upon you, then to be told there's a time constraint. So I trust on the next occasion we get a date quickly and there is adequate time, because as you are busy negotiating, we will want to be busy questioning you, and I hope you will respond in that spirit on the next occasion.
Indeed you will be, and I hope it's been a satisfactory session for everybody to ask questions today. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Order.